Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm here with Sally Clarke. She's an author, researcher, and speaker on well-being and burnout for individuals and organizations. A former finance lawyer, she works with individuals and teams to guide growth, insight, and transformational change. Her mission is to embed well-being at work so people and organizations can thrive. She's the author of 2 Amazon best-selling books on burnout, including Protect Your Spark. Sally is the co-host of We Are Human Leaders, a yoga and meditation teacher, a travel lover, and an avid runner. She has lived on 4 continents, speaks multiple languages, and is currently based between Amsterdam and Australia. And I am so excited to have you on the podcast today, Sally. Welcome.
Thank you. It's such a delight to be here.
Yeah, amazing. So can you tell us a little bit more about your business and the podcast, right? Like how does it come together?
Yeah, great question. So I think podcasting is something that I'd kind of always thought about as being something really interesting for me because I love conversations. My favorite thing in the world is a conversation that I leave understanding myself, the other person, and the world at large better. So I was always kind of attracted to it, but I have to say, felt a bit nervous. It's almost like when I was writing my books as well. It's like, isn't the market already flooded? Does the world need my voice? That kind of imposter syndrome. But luckily I met and connected with Alexa Sana. So she's my co-director of Human Leaders. So we met about 2.5 years ago. We've been working together at Human Leaders. So we do consultancy and leadership development to help really embed the leadership qualities that tomorrow's leaders really need. And as part of that, very early is that when we met, we really clicked around this idea of also having a podcast for do a number of things. And of course, there's the kind of the business and commercial side of it, I'm sure we'll get into. But for me, it's really about being able to speak to some of the world's leading thinkers at the intersection of leadership, but also things like well-being, spirituality, a kind of a new and novel way of thinking about leadership. So we really try to create those kind of conversations that are going to stretch people's brains a little bit and really bring something new.
So does that mean that you also started the business quite early on after starting the podcast, very early on after starting the business? Or was there kind of an in-between time where you focus on the business first and then later the podcast came? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Alexis had already established Human Leaders before I came on board. So it was really came out of the pandemic. It started really more as a kind of a community of leaders who really understand that the old ways of doing things at work aren't working and that we really need to focus on who we are as a human first and a leader second. Mm-hmm. So she established this beautiful framework. I came on board because things were growing. So we were starting to lead these webinars, lead development trainings for different companies and teams. And at the same time, so that was probably about, I think, a 6-month window between when I came on board and when we launched the podcast. So it was probably January 2022, and we launched our podcast in July 2022. So we had a little bit of an understanding, of what we wanted to do, what we were doing, the kind of conversations we were having, and how we wanted to almost fill a gap in the podcast market. And it's difficult to think in those terms because often it just feels like there's a podcast about everything. Yeah. But I think we forget sometimes that it's so important, whoever's listening right now, you have a unique voice. Even if you think what you're saying is quite similar to others, the way you synthesize ideas and the way you bring these ideas to your audience is unique. And it's really important, I think, to retain that focus on, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that your voice is unique and therefore worthy of being shared through a podcast.
Do you feel like it was helpful that there was already information about the community, clients, and what they were looking for exactly, like that kind of those conversations were already been had before starting the podcast? Or how do you see that? Like, did that help at all, and how did that help?
Great question. Yeah, it definitely did, because we were actually at the time focusing more on running webinars for the community. So we had this sort of human leaders community, and that still exists today. However, because like at that time we were coming out of the pandemic, and I think everyone was kind of looking for this online community, what we've seen is that really what people are looking for today is in-person connection. So a lot more of our work today is really about developing programs that are very tailored and sort of custom made for organizations and teams to experience the growth that they need. And so a little bit less around the sort of community aspect of things. What was great about that, though, was we were having conversations at the time with a lot of really interesting people who were thought leaders in, work and leadership. So by the time we wanted to launch the podcast, we already had probably 6 to 10 names in mind and connections with those people that were really quite prominent in their fields. So we were able to launch in quite an impactful way and really leverage their existing networks as well to kind of get that immediate resonance with a community. So that was definitely something that was very important for us at that stage. And also in terms of framing the kind of questions that we wanted to ask and the kind of conversations that we wanted to drive, sort of having this experience of working within the community and leading trainings and sort of helping people understand these concepts and sort of get an experiential feel for them too. So it almost happened quite organically. I think we didn't plan it that way, that the podcast would launch 6 months after I came on board and probably 12 months after Human Leaders had been established. But it turned out to be quite a good timing, I think, for us in terms of optimizing the reach that the podcast could have.
Yeah, and it sounds like you were also very intentional about the podcast and how the podcast was set up, and also about your launch, right? I think if you want to launch a business and a podcast around the same time, or maybe if it's, well, I think there is a time that it could be too early, right? When you're scrambling to get everything done. And you might not be able to be that intentional about these things and to find the right people to launch the podcast with in terms of those guests who you want on for the first few episodes as well, right? I think I can really hear from your story that you really took the time to think about, okay, what do we want this podcast to do? Who do we want on? What questions do we want to ask? And then tie that all back into a podcast strategy that works, that for you, like, and for the business at that time.
Yeah, definitely, Anna. And I think one of the things was because, you start a startup and then in 3 months, everything's just humming along perfectly. Yeah. We've certainly experienced, business challenges in an ongoing way. So it wasn't that the business was perfect and then we launched a podcast. But I think having, for example, the human leadership framework, which Alexis and I developed, already kind of, there and sort of being clear on our messaging and starting to work with clients. So we'd kind of gotten that little bit of momentum going for our business first, I think was helpful. And I think we probably would have, had we tried to do the podcast at the same time, we really would have diluted our energy and our impact. And that might not be true for everyone. If you have access to more resourcing, or if the podcast is more of a central sort of funnel for your business, then that might be something that's really essential for you to do sort of at the very early stage. But for us, it made sense to first kind of get a really, really accurate and very intentional, I love that word that you've used, understanding of who we are, where we fit in, and how we can really add to people's lives through the conversations that we're having. And that's really, I think, been something that's helped us sort of grow the podcast in the way that we wanted to and get that sort of great feedback that we've been getting.
Yeah, exactly. How has it worked out in the end, like, okay, this is a while ago already, but do you remember when you launched the podcast, like what kind of results were you seeing? Were you really happy with the results? Were you maybe like slightly disappointed with download numbers or any other results? Can you share a little bit more about like what happened after launching?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and you're actually taking me back to stuff that I haven't thought about for a while. So one of the things that we actually, when we originally started, we were first going to kind of make it more of a discussion between Alexis and I. And we were writing these scripts and getting really sort of deep into this process of like, what do we want to say? How do we tell our stories? And we realized, and it was a real uphill battle. And we sort of at a certain point looked at each other and said, this is not what we want to do. We actually really need to be like more, what do we want to do strategically? That's when we pivoted sort of from it being a kind of a conversation between the two of us about topics that impact leadership and work culture, to hosting conversations with other thought leaders. And this has really worked for us for a number of reasons. One is that our network, we've been able to connect with these incredible voices in this space, and they are often, they're really generous with their time, and that's sort of helped our own sort of networking capabilities. That's kind of one sort of pivot that we made reasonably early that worked for us. So we hadn't actually launched the podcast at all through this process. We went through this process and made the decision to shift to a conversation-based podcast before we launched. And I think that was helpful that we weren't sort of post-launch making that pivot. And another thing, so we have actually shifted platforms a couple of times, and this has made it difficult for us in terms of tracking numbers, because at first, so the first platform that we're at, I won't name names, but the first one we were at was kind of showing some lower figures, and we were honestly, I mean, obviously it hurts your ego a little bit, but our intention was always to really just have great conversations and to see this as a long game and not something that we're immediately going to blow up and go viral with. So then the second platform that we were on, the numbers jumped suddenly, and we were obviously, our egos were super thrilled by this. And with the third platform, it's kind of come to almost like a sort of a happy medium, if you will. So where we're at is we're seeing steady growth. We're also seeing global growth, which has been really exciting to see that it's, across, I think, 45 countries at the moment, and, topping or coming close to the top of charts in the US, the Netherlands, the UK, and then also like Brazil and other places that we were kind of like, oh, this is so exciting to also be resonating for sort of these other jurisdictions. But I think, it's that change in sort of the more logistical side of things impacted our ability to sort of really track accurately our growth over the last 2 years. But I think, that's also led to us deciding to stick with the current platform that we have and be able to sort of going forward sort of track that quite accurately. And we're in conversations with a couple of podcast networks as well at the moment to hopefully be able to shift our reach more next year. That's one of our big goals.
Wow, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Have you already, I don't know if you're already at this stage, if you can share about this, but what are kind of the pros and cons of working with a podcast network? Because I know that a lot of podcasters want this or might have, or like on the one hand, but then on the other hand, maybe other podcasters have never heard of this. So can you share more about kind of your research and why you're interested in this?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's something that it's kind of like getting a series, like a TV series picked up, I think, rather than just sort of broadcasting out of your own garage. That's a very Gen X metaphor. The kind of, I think for us, it's like it's being able to kind of get there's just an extra level of professionalism and a bigger reach, because a lot of people do rely on podcast networks to kind of discover a new podcast that they might want to try, and sort of by virtue of being on the same network as other really cool podcasts, that can obviously expand your reach. And I think the potential cons, which is what we've been really mindful about the networks that we have had conversations with and we're looking to maybe work with, is that we're happy to have, support in the terms of their, if they want to be involved in sort of thinking about the strategy for our podcast, that's absolutely welcome. But as long as we are able to remain authentic and true to what we do and who we are, these are really important core values that Alexis and I have, and that we've sort of designed for the podcast as well, so that we're not feeling like we're diluting the experience for the listener. Because honestly, I'd rather do it forever by ourselves than feel like we are selling out or minimizing in any way the outcome and that kind of experience that we really want to offer our listeners.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that it doesn't hurt your brand, that it will help it grow, right? And that it doesn't, backfire and like not be a good fit. So
and it's interesting because it could even authenticity is a core value of mine, and it's also something that's very important to us as well. So it's like that kind of happy balance of being able to get support, maybe some more advertising and sort of revenue, which is obviously an amazing thing to have as a podcast if we get to that point. But at the same time, not feeling like this is not ours anymore, or it's not what we set out to do. And that's something that we're very mindful of and very intentional about in these conversations.
Yeah, exactly. It's what you said. You're looking for the happy middle where it is a win-win for everyone and it helps the brand. That absolutely makes sense. How has it been to host a podcast together with someone else, with a co-host? Such
a great question. It's one of those things where I'm a recovering control freak. So part of me is like,
aren't we all?
So, it's one of those things where, I think for those of us who like to control everything, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But honestly, I couldn't have done this without Alexis. Alexis is really great at the post-production side of things, and a lot of the, like all the sort of the posting and the logistics once we've recorded is sort of falls into her responsibilities, and I'm more the research and developing questions and that lawyer brain that I bring to sort of the pre-production side of things. And I think what we've found, and this has definitely improved. When I listen back to old episodes, I can really see the distinct improvement in our cadence as we host together, because and I think we've always been reasonably good at this, but we get a lot of feedback from our guests that the way we kind of move between us, if you will, and how we ask the questions and how we sort of balance the conversation feels really organic and sort of supportive. And there are so many times where I'm like, I hear Lex ask a question and I'm like, boom, yeah, like I didn't, the way she synthesizes ideas that perhaps I hadn't at that moment. Mm-hmm. So honestly, I think it's something, if you have the opportunity to work with someone and you trust them and that sort of alignment in what you're looking to achieve, then I think it's a really, really valuable thing to do it with someone else.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I think, again, it sounds like this was a very conscious decision to co-host this. I think it can be a challenge, right? If it's maybe not the right person, or I think also for some people it can be a challenge, but it can be a beautiful thing as well. It sounds like you and Alexis are such a good team. I think the challenge can also often be, especially when you do, so I have a co-host for my other podcast, Digital Nomad Stories, but we do our own interviews. So most interviews are still one-on-one. So it's either me with a guest or my co-host Kendra with a guest. So it's different, right? But I think if you're doing interviews together, so you're really like co-hosting the same interview, like I've had people like, really talk over each other, or if you want to go in a different direction with the interview, like there's definitely challenges that you can have. So I think it's really good. And I think it makes so much sense. I think everyone who has been on this podcast has said that they cringe a little bit when they listen to their earlier episodes, so there's always improvement, which is a good thing.
I'm so glad I'm not alone, and I think that's the thing, like everything, unless you're perhaps a really seasoned journalist and you're starting a podcast, even then it's really about sort of, doing a lot of preparation. I do a lot of work, I'm a yoga teacher as well. So there's like that yoga and meditation, all the things that I can do to really ground myself in the moment, that Alexis and I have seen really serves us really well is getting to this high level of preparation, but then being very present for the conversation. And what we notice is, we have a sort of a set list of questions that we share with our guests, but we also ask their permission to deviate from them. And we're finding increasingly we kind of do, because we're very present in that moment when we're recording. And that means that the conversation can kind of evolve in what feels like a very organic way, but that really does add sort of a richness and a level of value that I think we wouldn't necessarily have if we just stuck to our questions.
Yeah, exactly. It's follow-up questions, but also, like seeing, kind of like analyzing almost what your guest says and then like building bridges. I think that's so cool if you can do that, but it's such a skill. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's like, it's so true. Like, and it's been wild for us to hear back from like some of these like super leading voices that we're fangirling big time to, for them to say to us, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that before, or you just expressed it perfectly. Can I use that on my blurb? Like this kind of things. So again, that's taken a lot of practice and a lot of effort. But it's really gratifying to us to sort of also hear that for the guest, it's something that the experience itself is also rewarding for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So now obviously the podcast is doing so well. You're talking with networks and you've seen great growth. What are some of the challenges that you've had, or maybe things that you had to change over the past few years after launching the podcast?
That's a great question. I think one of them is, we've had a couple of sort of once-off sponsors, but we haven't found a sort of a sponsor that we've felt like we really wanted to work with, and there was that kind of mutual relationship. So that's been a bit of a struggle. It's one of those things where because you're not immediately seeing the monetary return, it's difficult to kind of, especially after 6 to 12 months, when you're kind of like, this is a lot of effort and it really does take a lot of energy to get things right. Am I getting that return on the investment of my time and energy? And we've had one or two clients come out of, who've heard the podcast and reached out to us, which is great. So there is that sort of a little bit of a funnel impact that it's having. But it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for any podcaster is to stay committed to it. Mm-hmm. And there have been moments where we've been sort of, like, oh, are we doing it right? Particularly when we saw numbers drop because we'd switched platforms. It was like, are we talking to ourselves?
Yeah.
It's that kind of the ego thing that I think we've had to overcome. We've also had a couple of times that we've decided not to air an interview that we've done. And in both cases, really, it was just because despite having done quite a lot of research into these people in advance, read their books, prepared the questions, we were just really sort of shocked, honestly, by what they said, their manner, and the kind of things that they were saying that didn't feel like an alignment with ourselves and with human leaders. And those were both very glaring instances where, the guest would leave and we would just look at each other and go, I don't think we can use that. Is it just me? And then the other person saying, no.
Yeah.
Like, wow. So I think that's not so much of a challenge, but that sort of speaks to the alignment I think that Alexis and I have in terms of the kind of conversations that we want to have, the kind of guests that we want to have. And I think, we've been working with a great production team. That was probably early on a little bit of a challenge as well. We were working with a friend who had offered to do it, and that just ended up, he happened to be going through a difficult time of his life as well, and it just meant there was quite a lot of stress around turnaround of episodes at that time. So we ended up just having a really warm conversation with the three of us where we said, look, we love you, but let's put an end to this. And so we've outsourced that since, and it's been a super smooth process where we just stick our audio files in a Google Docs folder and ta-da, it turns out beautifully within a couple of days. So we're really pleased with that. And I think in terms of what sort of surprised us, I think, is that we thought we would sort of have to fight to get guests, but we've found even some of the sort of top voices in the space that we work in have been incredibly generous with their time in terms of being a guest as well. So that's been something that I think we might have expected to be a challenge, but it actually hasn't. And that of course is really gratifying to see that these people that we read their books, we underline and highlight all their books, and then they actually want to chat to us on the podcast.
That's so cool.
It's really awesome.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so I think a few lessons that you shared that I absolutely agree with. Find a workflow that works for you, and there might be some trial and error. Working with a company or with a person, like it's sometimes you have to find the right company or the right person that can really help you and take that stress off. And in my experience, that also makes it easier to stay consistent and actually to keep the motivation going. When I started my other podcast, I started, editing my own thing, because even though I had my team of the podcast babe, they're like, oh, well, this is just like a side thing, I'll just quickly do this. And at some point I was demotivated. I outsourced it to the team, which is actually crazy. Like, it's my own team. I don't know why I didn't do that from the start. But, one of those things. And it feels so much easier because you can focus on what you want to do, which is for many podcasts having these conversations, right? What you also mentioned, and not having to worry about all the back end stuff. So finding out what works in that way so that you can also stay motivated.
I think it's such an important point more broadly for any entrepreneur really in your business to, it's looking to get to a point where you can really take as many of those tasks that you don't enjoy as much off of your plate so that you can focus your time and energy on the things that you really get a lot out of. And I think for us, we've found a great organization that was able to kind of, take that off of our plates and help us to feel, take one thing off that might have been quite demotivating had we still been doing our own sort of, editing, which is it's an incredibly taxing process. And I imagine that it's probably cost a lot of podcasters their podcast because it just takes so much time and energy that it just makes it very demotivating. So any outsourcing you can do it. Yeah, exactly. That's a really good tip. Thank you so much for sharing your podcast journey with us today, Sally. It was really cool to hear kind of, literally the journey, from before launching, how you made those decisions, what to do, what format, and then how that all ended up the podcast that it is today. I'm so excited for you that you're talking to these networks and that you're really looking at next steps for the podcast. Super, super exciting. Before I let you go, can you please share where people can find the podcast? And we'll also link it in the show notes, but I also want to make sure that we can, for people who are listening and want to remember. Amazing. Well, we are across 14 different places that you can find and listen to your podcast, including Apple and Spotify. You can also go to www.wearehumanleaders.com/podcast, and all of the episodes are there, as well as show notes. And of course, feel welcome to reach out to me, find me on LinkedIn, or have a quick look in these show notes and find my contact details. I'd be happy to chat more about our experience. And yeah, just really anyone who's listening and is thinking about it, I really encourage you to use your unique voice and bring it to the world.
I love it. That's perfect parting words, I think. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Sally. Thank you for listening, dear listener, and see you next time. All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.